Hey everyone, this is a piece by a Milton Alvin. Um, it's titled Russia, a Workers' State. The reason I'm reading this is because it is referenced in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. I'm just kind of like reading through the little articles in this book as a whole. So I if this the piece is titled Russia, a Worker State, and obviously if it's I'm reading this for reference purposes because I did not accept that Stalinist Russia was anything comparable to a worker state. But anyway, it's from a discussion within the journal New International on titled "Is the Soviet Bureaucracy a New Class?" So here we go. The epoch of the decline of capitalism is characterized by world wars and unprecedented destruction of cities and countries together with their states and cultures, and the production of misery on a hitherto unknown scale. This has caused some individuals not content with the Marxian analysis of history and perspectives, which failed to produce a revolution in time to avoid the Second World War, to cast about for other explanations. It is in place, therefore, to review briefly our method and its application to the Soviet Union, which is usually the starting point for attempts to revise our theory. Section 1. Classes in Society. In defining the Marxian method of historical materialism, Engels wrote, quote, "The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life, and next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed in society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social change and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange." End quote. Engels. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Chapter 3. Thus we see that classes in society arise out of the needs of production and for no other reasons. The progress of historical development has produced classes in societies based upon class exploitation to a point in modern times where, under capitalism, two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, remain two opposing and irreconcilable forces, one of which must ultimately move humanity forward on the road to complete social and economic freedom. The bourgeoisie, today in its death agony because of its inability to solve the multifarious contradictions existing in capitalist society, is excluded from playing this progressive historical role. The bourgeoisie's continued rule can only lead to continuous wars, crises, depressions, etc., the accumulated results of which may very well lead humanity back to barbarism. On the other hand, the proletariat, the only class in modern society able to transform production from capitalist anarchy to production for use on a higher level commensurate with the potentialities inherent in modern technology, can play a progressive role. The proletariat, itself a product of the needs of capitalist production, can fulfill the proletariat's historic mission only by so organizing production as to release from production the fetters of private property and all private property's concomitant restrictions. To do this, it is necessary to expropriate the bourgeoisie, to statify, i.e., own in common, the means of production, and to develop these means of production to the highest possible level in accordance with a plan. This mode of production, state ownership plus production according to plan, constitutes a different mode of production from the capitalist, based upon a production for profit, and consequently determines the nature of the social structure resting upon it. Common ownership of the means of production makes it unnecessary for exploiting and exploited classes to exist, and therefore the ultimate result is the classless socialist society. Relations of classes to property forms, private property, state property, do not exist in the abstract but in the concrete needs of production itself and are determined by those needs. Every ruling class in history has defended the particular mode of production which existed as a result of its particular form of property ownership, the latter being interrelated to and interdependent upon what was produced, how it was produced, and how the products were exchanged. The bourgeoisie, for example, as a property-owning class, has an indivisible relationship to the property forms peculiar to the social production of commodities for private profits, i.e. capitalist production. Under the feudal system, the landed aristocracies also had an indivisible relationship to the then existing property forms, and defended them tooth and hide against the challenge of the rising bourgeoisie who wanted to introduce into society a new mode of production and a new form of property. The modern proletariat, seeking to release from the productive forces the restrictions placed upon them by private property relations, is just as indivisibly bound up with another property form, common ownership of the means of production. The proletariat does not seek to abolish property in general, but to abolish bourgeois property. Relations of classes to property forms are material questions, based upon the historical development of the needs of production and dependent upon the given level of this development in any particular epoch. In our epoch, quote, the death agony of capitalism, end quote, the form of property existing under bourgeois rule, capitalist property, is in conflict with the productive forces and generates a class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which can be resolved only by the victory of the proletariat and the consequent change in the mode of production. The emergence of a new class in society must be based upon a new mode of production. History has never known a class which appeared for any other reason, and in fact, there is no other reason. Trotsky wrote, quote, the historical justification for ever ruling class consists in this, that the system of exploitation it headed raised the development of the productive forces to a new level, end quote. And, quote, a social organ, in such as every class, including an exploiting class, can take shape only as a result of the deeply rooted inner needs of production itself, end quote. Trotsky, USSR in War, November 1939, which is on this channel. Section 2. The Soviet Union. The proletariat struck out on the road of world revolution in Russia in 1917. The result of the October Revolution was the establishment of a workers' state which expropriated the bourgeoisie and nationalized all important factories, banks, mines, railroads, means of communication, and established a state monopoly of industrial enterprise and foreign trade. The workers' state established new property forms in the Soviet Union. This was the outstanding and the fundamental result of the proletarian revolution. The large-scale development of the productive forces, even though carried out by the reactionary Stalin regime, testifies to the superiority of these new forms over the old, and supplies us with the historical justification of the proletariat as a, quote, ruling class, end quote. Again, this is going to be, this is something that you notice that is consistent with things you hear in Trotsky, right? The first chapter I get is, The Revolution Betrayed, is full of glowing admiration for the so-called advancements of the Stalin regime, as if it was not predicated on immense exploitation of the direct producers, both industrial producers and agricultural producers, both proletariat and peasantry. That's just a side note for myself. The relations to these new property forms on an international scale were divided according to classes. The bourgeoisie sought to destroy and the proletariat to defend the new property forms. During the upsurge of the proletarian revolutionary movement internationally, the workers exercised direct control of the state, which directed the economy of the country, through the Soviets, trade unions, factory committees, army committees, and the Revolutionary Party. However, when this upsurge failed to bring the workers to power in the more advanced Western European countries, an upset in the Soviet Union, then isolated from world economy. Section 3. The Bureaucracy. The ebb, the fundamental cause of which was the defeat of the workers of Western Europe, plus the exhaustion of the Soviet masses, living in a backward country with many remains of Tsarist economy, culture, and social traditions, brought about the political victory of Stalinism, the embodiment of the defeat of the International Revolution. Stalinism proceeded in stages to destroy one by one the gains of the revolution. Stalinism usurped political control, eliminated workers' control completely by destroying or rendering useless the organs of that control. This destruction of the gains of the revolution has assumed a frightful degree of quantity as it has invaded almost every aspect of Soviet life. Without listing each one, it has brought the Soviet masses to the point at which it is impossible to visualize a peaceful reform of the Stalin bureaucracy, thereby necessitating a violent removal of this malignant growth upon the workers' revolution. This violent removal we characterize as, quote, political revolution, as differentiated from a, quote, social revolution, for the reason that, with all the changes introduced into Soviet life by the bureaucracy, it has not yet decisively changed the economic foundations, that is, the new mode of production established by the proletarian revolution. I don't even think Trotsky would use the word new mode of production here, but, well, maybe he would. He thought that production was socialistic, but distribution was not, as if you could arbitrarily separate the distribution and production. This remains, together with the monopoly of foreign trade, substantially unaltered, and is the indispensable characteristic of the proletarian revolution. The resolution adopted by the founding convention of the Socialist Workers' Party, January 1938, stated, quote, ... the wiping out of the entire revolutionary generation, occurring simultaneously with the complete deprivation of all democratic rights of the masses and the sanctification of the Bonapartist regime of absolutism, has been carried through by the Stalinist bureaucracy with the deliberate purpose of creating all the political conditions for a fundamental assault upon the economic basis of the workers' state, namely the nationalization of the means of production and exchange. Just as the revolutionary proletariat, in seizing power in 1917, I don't know why I said 1914, 1917, created the political conditions for the expropriation of private property, so the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, by consuming its dispossessing of the proletariat, by consummating its dispossessing of the proletariat from political power, has created the political conditions for the destruction of nationalized economy and the restoration of private property, end quote. And that was the fear. That's why it was Stalin was viewed until Trotsky's death as a form of totalitarian centrism that mediated between the so-called right forces represented by most of the peasantry, or the peasantry, and the so-called people who wanted to extend the NEP, the so-called right opposition around Bukharin. It crushed them as well as the left opposition. So the Soviet Union, the Stalinist state, to my understanding, as Trotsky understood it, was viewed as a reactionary centrist force between the so-called left and rights of the Bolshevik Party, which ostensibly represented distinct interest in the society. And so what would have been necessary would have been a unification between the so-called right opposition and the left opposition, if anything remotely democratic about the USSR, which is, even doubtful in this period, preserve any of it whatsoever. It would have been necessary for them to unite against Stalin, but which was not, because the worst of all enemy foes was viewed as those such as Bukharin, who wanted to extend the NEP, thought it was the only viable thing that the Bolshevik Party could do, whereas the Stalinists and the left opposition thought industrializing the country as quick as possible was the way. Not that Trotsky's opposition necessarily would have adopted the same means that the Stalinists did in their industrialization drive, but anyway, that's the end of that quote. I should have said that already, I guess. The bureaucracy, therefore, can establish itself definitively as a class in the Soviet Union only by destroying the proletarian property forms and re-establishing capitalist property forms. It is inconceivable that it is or can become a new and hitherto unknown class, a reactionary class at that, based upon property forms peculiar to the proletariat. If it is a new class, it must first arise out of the needs of production, and second, construct new property forms. But the bureaucracy, instead of finding in the new, i.e. proletarian mode of production established by the October Revolution, an economic basis conducive to its stable existence, found itself in conflict with that mode of production. Quote, this was veiled for a certain time by the fact that Soviet economy was occupied for 2 decades with transplanting and assimilating the technology and organization in advanced capitalist countries. The period of borrowing and imitation still could, for better or for worse, be accommodated to bureaucratic automatism, i.e. the suffocation of all initiative and all creative urge. But the higher the economy rose, the more complex its requirements became, all the more unbearable became the obstacles of the bureaucratic regime. The constantly sharpening contradiction between them leads to uninterrupted political convulsions, to systematic annihilation of the most outstanding creative elements in all spheres of activity. Thus, before the bureaucracy could succeed in exuding from itself a, quote, ruling class, it came into irreconcilable contradiction with the demands of development. The explanation for this is to be found precisely in the fact that the bureaucracy is not the bearer of a new system of economy peculiar to itself and impossible without itself, but is a parasitic growth on a worker's state. End quote. Trotsky, USSR in War, New International, November 1939. Emphasis of the current author, Martin Alvin. That's his name, right? Milton Alvin, excuse me. Quote, the Soviet oligarchy possesses all the vices of the old ruling classes, end quote. Trotsky wrote, quote, but lacks their historical mission, end quote. One may even say that it has these vices in much greater degree, but this will not solve the question, is it a class or a caste? Comrade Shachtman has now come forward as the discoverer of a new ruling class in the Soviet Union. Shachtman finds that the complete control of the state, which is the repository of the means of production by the Soviet bureaucracy, results in its becoming a class. Shachtman says, quote, ... what is crucial are not the property forms, i.e. nationalized property, whose existence cannot be denied, but precisely the relations of the various social groups in the Soviet Union to this property, i.e. property relations, exclamation point, end quote. Shachtman, Is Russia a Worker State? New International, December 1940. Again, that is available on this channel. Emphasis in original. But property relations do not exist in the abstract, nor are property relations the result of political causes, but of economic causes. The complete control of the state based on national property by the bureaucracy does not guarantee the ownership of this property by the bureaucracy. Quote, the bureaucracy has neither stocks nor bonds. The bureaucracy is recruited, supplemented, and renewed in the manner of an administrative hierarchy, independently of any special property relations of its own. Independently of any special property relations of its own. The individual bureaucrat cannot transmit to his heirs his rights in the exploitation of the state apparatus. The bureaucracy enjoys its privileges under the form of an abuse of power. It conceals its income. It pretends that as special social group it does not even exist. End quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. One of the things that I was going to say here is that it seems to be saying that state rule based upon nationalized property is impossible. Just full stop, it's impossible. The only way that a class rule based upon nationalized property could come to exist is if the bureaucracy privatized sections of the nationalized economy for its own ends. That seems to be what is the logical consequence of what Trotsky is saying here. And again, The Revolution Betrayed is on this channel. What thing I was going to say? The other thing that I was going to say is that the bureaucracy fundamentally did pass on its relations to property to its nationalized property to its children. I believe that there was a pretty substantial, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I believe there was pretty substantial cutting in access to education in the Stalin period compared to other places which had like a more of an affirmative action approach. I'm not sure, but definitely like kind of like the privileges and kind of like the informal privileges that gathered around the bureaucracy definitely were transferred to the children of the bureaucracy, who usually found places in the bureaucracy themselves. They did not become sovnarkozy or people who worked in collective farms or laborers in the factories. They usually became some type of bureaucrats themselves with privileged access to education, which would be a substantial part of being granted access to bureaucratic power in the future, or just like becoming part of the technical intelligentsia. But that's just a side note for myself. That's my opinion. The bureaucracy, in order for it to become a class, must have special property relations of its own. In other words, the bureaucracy must destroy the existing forms of property, nationalize property, and construct a new form of property which will give it some measure of stability. Then we can speak of it as a new class. Comrade Shachtman says, quote, for the given system, the property relations established by the counter-revolution, the Stalinist bureaucracy is the indispensable ruling class, end quote. What different property relationship did the counter-revolution establish? He does not say, and he cannot, because the counter-revolution has not yet fundamentally changed Soviet economy. The form of property established by the October Revolution remains substantially unaltered, and though the bureaucracy acts as a fetter upon it and is in conflict with it, Shachtman admits that it still remains. This testifies not to the adaptability of the bureaucracy, if it is a class, to proletarian forms of economy, but rather to the historical, quote, staying power of the new forms despite their isolation from the world economy in its last stages of decay and the relatively low technological development of industry in the Soviet Union. Comrade Shachtman says, quote, the conquest of state power by the bureaucracy spelled the destruction of the property relations established by the Bolshevik Revolution, end quote. And further, quote, ... is the product of a conjunction of circumstances, ... end quote. Trotsky gave adequate answer to this method in a polemic against Crépieux. Ivan Crépieux was a French Trotskyist who independently developed his own conception of bureaucratic collectivism. I actually have a piece from Ivan Crépieux on this channel titled Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, which is from, not titled that, but it's from Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, edited by Ernest Haberkern and Arthur Lippau. Check out all those pieces. They're all worth your time. Quote, this is Trotsky. Quote, the bourgeoisie came into the world as an element born of the form of production. The bourgeoisie remained a historic necessity as long as the new form of production had not exhausted the possibilities. The same assertion can be made with regard to all previous social classes. Slave owners, the feudal lords, the medieval master artisans. In their time, they were all the representatives and leaders of a system of production which had its place in the advance of humanity. How then does Crépieux appraise the historic place of the, quote, bureaucracy class, end quote? He doesn't say anything on this decisive question. Nevertheless, we have repeated many times, with the aid of Crépieux himself, that the degeneration of the Soviet state is the product of the retardation in the world revolution, that is to say, the result of political and, quote, conjunctural, end quote, causes, so to speak. Can one speak of a new, quote, conjunctural class? I really doubt that. If Crépieux will consent to verify his rather precipitate conception from the point of view of the historic succession of social regimes, he will surely recognize himself that to give the bureaucracy the name possessing class is not only an abuse of terminology, but moreover a great political danger which can lead to the complete derailment of our historic perspective. Does Crépieux see sufficient reason to revise the Marxist conception on this capital point? As for myself, I do not see any. That is why I refuse to follow Crépieux, end quote. Trotsky, once again, the USSR and its defense. That's probably on this channel. I'm not sure. I don't think it has that same title. Once again, on the nature of the USSR, probably. I'm not sure. Look for it, though. One has but to substantiate the name Shachtman for Crépieux. Substitute the name Shachtman for Crépieux. Both use the same method. This is the important feature. Shachtman states, quote, thereby it compelled us to add to our theory this conception, among others, just as it is possible to have different classes ruling in societies resting upon the private ownership of property, so it is possible to have more than one ruling class in a society resting upon ... the collective ownership of property, concretely the working class and the bureaucracy, end quote. Shachtman. This is a masterpiece of oversimplification and destroys the Marxist method of historical materialism. Shachtman does not approach this problem from the point of view of the historic development of classes, which arose out of the needs of production and played a socially necessary role, each in turn. Shachtman divides all former ruling classes into, quote, classes ruling in societies resting upon the private ownership of property, end quote, and, quote, more than one class ruling in a society resting upon the collective ownership of property, end quote. Shachtman. But the property-owning classes that have existed in the past, the bourgeoisie, feudal, slave owners, each owned different forms of property, to which each had established its own relationship. How does it happen now, then, that proletarian forms of property established by the October Revolution can serve as a base for another class? Shachtman does not go into this question. Comrade Shachtman finds theoretical justification for his new discovery in Trotsky's article, The USSR in War. In order to obtain a clear picture, it is necessary to quote at some length. I'm not sure if this is one quote or a series of quotes. But here we go. Quote, if this war provokes, as we firmly believe, a proletarian revolution, it must inevitably lead to the overthrow of the bureaucracy in the USSR and regeneration of Soviet democracy on a far higher economic and cultural basis than in 1918. In that case, the question as to whether the Stalinist bureaucracy was a, quote, class or a growth in the worker state will be automatically solved. To every single person, it will become clear that in the process of the development of the world revolution, the Soviet bureaucracy was only an episodic relapse. If, however, it is conceded that the present war will provoke not revolution but a decline of the proletariat, then there remains another alternative, the further decay of monopoly capitalism, its further fusion with the state and the replacement of democracy wherever it still remained by a totalitarian regime. The inability of the proletariat to take into its hands the leadership of society could actually lead under these conditions to the growth of a new exploiting class from the Bonapartist fascist bureaucracy. This would be, according to all indications, a regime of decline, signalizing the eclipse of civilization. An analogous result might occur in the event that the proletariat of advanced countries, having conquered power, should prove incapable of holding it and surrender it, as in the USSR, to a privileged bureaucracy. Then we would be compelled to acknowledge that the reason for the bureaucratic relapse is rooted not in the backwardness of the country, not in the imperialist environment, but in the congenital incapacity of the proletariat to become a ruling class. Then it would be necessary in retrospect to establish that in its fundamental traits, the present USSR was the precursor of a new exploiting regime on an international scale. Quote, we have diverged very far from the terminological controversy over the nomenclature of the Soviet state, but let our critics not protest. Only by taking the necessary historical perspective can one provide himself with a correct judgment upon such a question as the replacement of one social regime by another. The historic alternative, carried to the end, is as follows. Either the Stalin regime is an abhorrent relapse in the process of transforming bourgeois society, or the Stalin regime is the first stage of a new exploiting society. If the second prognosis proves to be correct, then of course the bureaucracy will become a new exploiting class. However onerous the second perspective may be, if the world proletariat should actually prove incapable of fulfilling the mission placed upon it by the course of development, nothing else would remain except openly to recognize that the socialist program based on the internal contradictions of capitalist society ended as a utopia. End quote. Trotsky's article opposes the possibility of the bureaucracy becoming a new ruling class, but Trotsky also says something about our program if this should be the case. Shall we discard the Marxist method and thereby risk a, quote, complete derailment of our historical perspective, end quote, in favor of Shachtman's schematism? This would be a major tragedy. Trotsky wrote, quote, 25 years in the scale of history, when it is a question of profoundest changes in economic and cultural systems, way less than an hour in the life of a man, end quote. Can we adorn the bureaucracy with a class mantle on the basis of the bureaucracy's role, less than 2 decades in development, just before its disappearance from the world? We would cut a pretty picture were we to do this. The present world crisis and war have forced upon the bureaucracy the necessity to arrogate to itself a greater share of the dwindling produce of the country, thereby further aggravating both the economic and political situations. Witness the recent ukases regarding education. I think ukases are decrees regarding education, working conditions, etc. The bureaucracy is balanced on the razor edge between outright capitalist restoration or its own destruction by the proletariat. No state in the world today is so unstable as the bureaucratically deformed worker state in the USSR. The large-scale purges, etc., indicate not a stable, powerful class taking bold measures, but a panicky, outlived and unneeded historical excrescence of usurpers trying to maintain itself in power. It has made itself master in every field, raise itself above the masses and crush all opposition precisely because it wants to change the form of economy and thereby constitute itself as a class. This has not yet happened, and we have no right to characterize a possibility, even a strong possibility, as an accomplished fact. The proletariat, which made the October Revolution, has proved itself the most powerful class in all history. Starting in a backward country, laid waste by several years of wars and revolution, the proletariat has maintained in 1/6 of the earth's surface a form of economy historically justified as far superior to any known to man, and has defended this form against a hostile amalgam of every reactionary element that can be found in every part of the world. Its monumental achievement still stands, although threatened from without and seriously undermined internally. After more than 2 decades of unprecedented world reaction, now culminated in the most destructive of all wars, let us not lose faith in the ability of the proletariat to regenerate the Soviet Revolution, and let us not surrender to a new class, the new form of economy, which remains to this day a weapon of the proletariat. And this is from Milton, Alvin, January 6, 1941. I don't know. I'm gonna see if I can't see any biography. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where Milton Alvin Milton ends up, or Milton Alvin ends up. I know that the New International went to the Workers' Party, and I'm not sure if it was firmly entrenched as an organ of the Workers' Party by 1941, because this is very critical of Shachtman for. Actually, when is it? It says it's from I guess it was republished in 1941, originally from May 1940, so I'm not sure actually when the original date of it is. Well, thank you for listening.